Join us for the path to global success. We'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples of the Treaty 6 region and the Métis settlements and Métis Nation of Alberta, regions 2, 3, and 4. We respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our community. The Ireland-Alberta Trade Association provides services and connections in support of bilateral trade between Ireland and Alberta. We highlight sectoral expertise and strengths between Alberta and Ireland and drive connections to build a vibrant economic corridor between our two regions. Now, as many of you know, March 17th marks St. Patrick's Day around the world. New this year in Canada, though, is this month, people across Canada will mark the first official Irish Heritage Month, as passed in Parliament unanimously March 10th, 2021. So this is our first full month. Irish Canadians have greatly contributed to the story of our country, and this month is an opportunity to learn more about their history and the positive impact across Canada. I'd like to thank our sponsors. Our foundational sponsor is Invest Alberta. Today's event sponsors are RBC Global Trade, Calgary Economic Development, and IDA Ireland. For the next 40 minutes, you're going to learn so much from this expert panel. We'll be following the presentation with Q&A. So if you have any questions, the panelists are looking forward to answering those. Just pop them into the Q&A section, please, so we can get to those once they're done the formal part. I'm going to do a brief introduction to our panelists and moderator, and then I'm going to hand it over to our moderator today. So our first panelist that I want to highlight is Sam Lin, the Senior Trade Finance Specialist with RBC Global Trade. As a Senior Trade Finance Specialist, Sam is dedicated to supporting Canadian businesses in expanding their reach on the global stage. In his role, Sam helps Canadian businesses to diversify their supply chain, providing proactive advice in an effort to identify and mitigate risk. Next up, we have Shona Riley, Manager Trade, Calgary Economic Development. Shona's diverse experience has helped her develop a network of tourism, sales, marketing, and economic development contacts throughout the community. Shona has worked with Calgary Economic Development for 6 years and launched the Southern Alberta cohorts of the Trade Accelerator Program in 2018. Excuse me. Next up, Michael Ansara. He's Senior Account Manager at EDC. As a Senior Account Manager and Technology Digital Industry Lead for the Alberta market at Export Development Canada, Michael supports all commercial business sectors. His expertise in financial trade and credit insurance solutions offered by EDC and his understanding of the trade ecosystem helps him advise and assist Canadian businesses to go, grow, and succeed internationally. Next up, we have Cheryl Lockhart, Trade Advisor, Edmonton Global. Cheryl delivers the Global Growth Trade Service for Edmonton Global and is a partner with Omni Management Consulting Alliance. Previously, Cheryl had been guiding Canadian businesses in international trade since 1998, first with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada as the trade officer for the Middle East and Africa, and then since 2002 as an independent consultant. Now, finally, our moderator, Deirdre Moran, who's the Canada Country Manager for IDA Ireland. IDA is the oldest inward investment agency of its kind in the world, celebrating 70 years in 2018. The IDA operates through a network of offices around the world, and Deirdre is based in Toronto. She opened the Toronto office where she works with a portfolio of large enterprise technology consumer and business services companies, from high-growth startups to well-established multinationals. Deirdre, thank you for moderating today, and thank you to all our panelists for joining us. I'm looking forward to this session.
Thank you, Lorraine. Delighted to be here, and really appreciate the opportunity to chat to such a great group of folk. So I'll give a quick background to IDA and what we do here, and then we'll get the conversation going. So as Lorraine mentioned, I work with IDA Ireland, which is a government agency that helps international companies explore opportunities to set up and do business from Ireland. We have 1,600 clients, about 70% of which are from North America, so from the US and Canada. They employ 275,000 people in Ireland. So it's a key part of our economic activity, very important to us. We work hard to ensure our investors are happy. And they span a number of sectors. So we take a fairly broad approach in terms of sectors, as do some of our speakers today. But we have some key clusters in pharma and biotech, medical devices, green tech and clean tech, financial services, engineering and industrial automation, and also software broadly. We have two teams that work kind of on enterprise software and consumer software. So everything from SaaS, cybersecurity, semiconductors, ed tech, travel tech, the whole gambit. As Lorraine mentioned, I'm based in Toronto, but we cover all of Canada from Toronto. Very much looking forward to getting back on the road and out to Alberta again soon, hopefully this summer. But it's nice to be there virtually today if I can't be there in person. We have about 60 Canadian companies in our portfolio today, and those companies employ about 7,000 people. They're very much using Ireland as a gateway to the European market. The Irish market is a market in its own right, but it is a small market, but it does give free and open access into the European, into the broader European market. So they're setting up EMEA operation centers, sales teams, support teams, and also software development teams. Obviously, there's a global war for talent now. There's a labor pool of about 300 million in Europe. And so obviously setting up in an EU country, there's no barriers in terms of access to that talent. So a lot of our Canadian companies are now building out engineering teams there as well. As I said, there's about 7,000 people employed by Canadian companies in Ireland. And interesting to note that this has grown by almost 40% in the last 4 years. So, we're really seeing more and more investment from our Canadian clients, which was part of the driver to open the office here to better support those companies. And we continue to see this growth. I suppose to bring it to life for you a little bit, just last week, TELUS International, which is a brand we all know and love that has roots in Alberta. TELUS International is the BPO or outsourced arm of TELUS. They spun out actually last year. They have 3 sites in Ireland employing about 2,000 people and announced a large expansion last week. They provide sales, support, and localization, moderation services for their clients across Europe. Shopify, they set up their European support team in Ireland about 5 or 6 years ago, initially with plans to hire about 30 people. Today, they have over 700 people across 30 different functions. So they do sales, support, HR, finance, IT, operations for all of Europe. It's a multilingual group. And interestingly, they have taken a fully remote approach to their Irish expansion. So Shopify is now digitally first, as some of you will be familiar with. It's fully distributed, but they actually took a lot of their learnings from their Irish rollout because it was the first country that they, I suppose, stood up a fully remote team back in 2015 before the pandemic forced it on a lot more companies, I guess. Clio, another great technology company, they're in the legal software space. Their founders, their CEO is actually from Edmonton, and they have an operation in Calgary. They chose Ireland as their European headquarters a few years ago, so they do sales, support, and also product management at their Irish base. Black Square from Calgary, they do software for the global drinks industry. They have a big client in Diageo, which pulled them into Europe, and they chose Ireland to start building out their support team for those clients. And then Absorb Software, another very, very good example there from Calgary, who set up their first international, their first non-North American office in Ireland back in 2015, doing sales and support for European clients. So some really, really great cohort of companies. That's just, I suppose, a reference 4 or 5 of the 60. And so what do we do for these companies? We provide a range of supports and services to our clients. I won't go through them in detail today, but in summary, I suppose the top, to put them into 3 buckets, a lot of information gathering right through the process. So from an early stage, gathering information on location selection, tax, legal, banking, all that fun stuff, right through property selection, if that's the route they're going, and so on. So a lot of information gathering. The second piece is a lot of case studies and best practice and peer networking. So we like to bring companies like yourselves, match them with peers that have similar, in aligned industries or similar business models, and let them, I suppose, learn from people who've done it before. You don't have to figure this all out from scratch. And finally, we have a range of financial packages as well. So we have employment grants, R&D supports, innovation supports as well to help companies as they go around their international expansion. So we're very much, our role in IDA, and similar to some of the organizations here today, is very much about partnering with Canadian companies on their growth journey, which is why I'm delighted to be here and moderate the panel today on paths to global trade. Our panelists have years of experience guiding companies through this process, and the hope of the conversation today really is to I suppose, highlight that, share those experiences, highlight some best practice, some tips and tricks, what to do, what not to do, and we'll talk about 3 key areas. So timing, when does it make sense to do this? What do you need to have ready? What are the triggers? Managing risk and execution. So we'll talk a little bit of how to maximize your chances of success. And finally, supports. As I said, you're not alone. These organizations have great supports and handholding. You don't have to do this by yourself and reinvent the wheel, essentially. So I guess we'll kick off and talk a little bit about timing and readiness. And Shona, I might start with you. At Calgary Economic Development, you work with lots of companies across different sectors. I know you work both on the trade and investment side, but it'd be great from your perspective to hear, how does a company know, and when do they start talking to you about going global, and when do you feel that they are ready for this conversation?
Of course. So I think I'll start with, I think kind of gone are the days where it's, ABCD. So city, province, national, and then international. I think people are looking global a lot quicker, a lot earlier. I will put a caveat there where capacity, you do need to make sure that you have the capacity to go global. So it's always a good problem to have when you've got new clients and everything, but you want to make sure that you're able to action on that as quick as possible. So I would say it depends on your sector too. So I'm sector agnostic. So I work with multi-sectors, and I see 2 very different things. I think technology and service there's different kind of benchmarks that they have to hit while they're looking at that global perspective versus consumer packaged goods. I think capacity is a lot more involved because you do have that tangible product also that you have to make sure that you're thinking about warehouse space, you're thinking, and I think in all sectors you have to think about, for me, number 1 is human resources. Do you have that capacity, right, in the going global side? But I think sometimes people think that you have to be this large brand to go global, but we're seeing so many smaller SMEs and startups that are looking outward quicker. And that might be because their product or service is a better fit in a different market than Canada, or maybe, they're going to prove it elsewhere a little bit and then coming back and then growing on that national level. So I do think that you want to make sure that you're prepared and you're looking at that capacity side. But I would say don't be scared and think that you have to be this big national brand to look global. But once again, I'd say that's a lot of what we kind of talk about in the Trade Accelerator program. And I would say if there's any pulls to that international market, we say, hey, okay, come and learn now. Come see maybe what you don't know about going into markets. But capacity for me is number 1.
And from the clients you're talking to, particularly in the TAP program, is there common triggers? Like, what's the most? Are they being pulled? Are they pushing this? Do they, what's their key drivers? Obviously, growth is a big one, but is there kind of some other commonalities in terms of triggers?
Yeah, of course. So I think maybe we've got some companies that have been very reactive, where they've had these pulls, they've done them, maybe not in the most strategic way, but they've had a couple purchase order or partnership requests and things along those lines. And they've done them, but they're like, hey, obviously now our product, service, technology has this potential globally. So let's start thinking about it a little bit more strategically on where we want to go. And on the other side, we've had some Calgary companies that they just know right away they want to be a global brand. They want that growth. So they're looking there, they are determined, and they are looking outward very quickly at that. So once again, I think it's a pretty broad spectrum, but I would say the biggest thing is that being proactive versus just the reactive.
Okay. And, you commented on capacity, and I suppose that's everything from human resources, but right through to, financial capacity and having the resources to do that. And Michael, I might bring you in here most people on the call will know EDC, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about how your organization fits in here and when companies start to engage with you around their expansion.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so those of you who don't know EDC, Export Development Canada is essentially a federal crown that's at arm's length from the federal government. So we have our own board, our own treasury. We make decisions for growth of GDP based on being agnostic to the market, and I guess, and we're non-tax funded, which is an important piece too, in terms of resources and availabilities from EDC in terms of where we play. So from an EDC perspective, once a company has commercialized, so they have a business model, they have a product, it's past the R&D stage, and they're looking at either diversifying their sales pipeline, or they're targeting a specific market, or in some cases perhaps they're being reactive to needs whereby they're being approached by other companies cross-border. That's when to engage EDC. It's very much more on education than it is on transaction. And you know, as Shona mentioned, capacity is a big piece, right? I've worked with companies where the CFO is the CEO, is the doorkeeper, and I've worked with companies where they have an entire team, but they're both trying to achieve similar goals, just in different ways. It's very much a graduated thing. So a lot of companies will speak to EDC on a basis of demystifying what we are, how we operate. One of the biggest stigmas that we try to get away from is that we only help multi-million-dollar companies. That's not it. We work with companies as small as revenues of $100,000, right? And cross-sector, doesn't have to be widgets. Maybe it's a service rendered, maybe it's tech, maybe it's education, agri-food. The entire intent for engagement with EDC is that somebody's looking to go beyond borders and to expand that finite sandbox of opportunities to make sales.
And do you, Michael, then get into the nitty-gritty then around location advice, or does a company come to you already having a good sense of where they want to go?
So that's a great question. So EDC more so is on the risk side, but we do have access to the entire ecosystem for global trade. So a lot of companies will say, hey, listen, I need to find a trade lawyer, or I'm trying to understand the logistics to get a project somewhere, or I need to know what the border restrictions or regulatory requirements are if I execute on an opportunity for, say, in Ireland. If we don't have those resources, we point them in the direction and connect them with people within the ecosystem. So whether it be Shona's team from a preliminary standpoint, or global affairs, or the trade commissioner service, or logistics providers, those are additional ancillary things that we do that are incubative to what we do later on.
Interesting. And I just, given you work across, I know your focus is around the tech piece, but obviously you work across a number of sectors. Is there trends that you see in terms of, you know, at any particular time that certain companies are growing faster than others, just given what's going on a global stage? You know, how do you, you know, is it particular sectors that you find yourselves working with more at different times?
Yeah, fair question. So yes, I serve as a tech lead for Alberta, but I work with companies across all sectors. So in Alberta, it could be anything from agri-food to light manufacturing to oil field services to tech for one of those subcategories. And I guess the important piece is, from a cross-border standpoint, is you don't know what you don't know. So from a preliminary standpoint, we find that we're less transactional and more part of the journey for a lot of these companies, and it's a graduated process. So from an early stage, they might develop, and then they have another linchpin, or there's some other crux that they need help with. If it's not something we necessarily help with, it's someone we connect them with.
Okay, absolutely. And we take a similar approach, as in companies have different needs at different stages of their journey. And, you know, we have different teams and different touch points that can try and assist them with that. And, you know, when we don't know the answer, we often have somebody, or we try to find somebody that does know the answer. So no, appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Cheryl, I might bring you in here then to talk a little bit about your role. I mean, you mentioned, you know, we know you provide a lot of strategic coaching to companies as they're looking at this journey. So maybe could you talk a little bit about that, and you know, some of the strategies that work and kind of help ensure success as they're starting on this journey?
Sure. Thanks, Tidri. Nice to be here. My approach, or what I think companies need to be successful, has actually been articulated quite well in a book called Trade Promotion Strategies, Best Practices. So the authors of this book researched national promotion agencies across the globe. So organizations like the Trade Commissioner Service here in Canada and all of their counterparts around the world. And they wanted to identify innovative best practices. And they found that strategies that typically focus on, you know, the traditional approach of which country are you going to go into, which region are you going to go into, what are you offering, and how are you going to promote that product, are inadequate. That's not enough. And instead, those companies that are most successful are the ones that really take a look at what Shona was addressing earlier, response capacity, but things also like adaptability, flexibility, their communication style, as well as delivery. So price and quality are just table stakes. And I think a lot of companies think that if they can find someone who's interested in their product, that's enough, or their service. They'll buy it regardless. And what we have is that in international markets, there's a rising expectation about what the seller is going to provide. And quite frankly, I think those expectations are quite different than what we have here in Canada, where the speed of business might be a little bit slower. And that's not to say on the day-to-day, everybody's extremely busy and you're reacting to the market, what's right in front of you. But I think the reactivity and the responsiveness and the communication on something like international trade, which I think a lot of business owners would view as a special initiative, is a little bit slower because they get caught up in what's in front of them on a day-to-day basis. And so, you know, if companies want to know if their export strategy is going to be successful, I'd invite them to get an outside perspective to weigh in on whether they are responsive, whether they do have a good communication strategy internationally, and that third party look, because from within you might think this is great. But I think an independent third party, not your potential customer, is valuable in that instance.
That's just really interesting what you referenced there in terms of different customers and different cultures having different expectations around response times. Like I spent a number of years in the US before I moved here, and even, you know, with the common language and the similar geography, like it's different. You know, it's definitely something that I was surprised to find it so different. But also it's very different between Ireland and North America as well. You know, there's lots of cultural nuances. Have you worked with many companies looking at Europe before? And is there a couple of things that you know, that stood out in terms of nuances in Europe? Obviously, you know, there's lots of different borders, different languages, different cultures. Has there been shocks to some of your clients around how different it is, or how have they managed that?
I think so. I'm thinking of one example of a client that was exploring opportunities in India. And once we started reaching out to potential partners, they loved the product and they wanted to get moving right away. Whereas my client was testing the waters, maybe wasn't clear enough in their expectations as to when they were ready to start entering that market, because they wanted to be able to travel there for their own comfort level. For the foreign partner, no problem. Like, we can do everything virtually. We can start selling your product tomorrow. And there's this huge gap in terms of the timeline, and that wasn't clarified, and it created a poor taste in the mouth, I think, of the local distributor in India. But yet my client just wasn't quite there yet. And so, but I think my client also maybe thought, there's lots of time, you know, it's a developing country in their perspective, not a huge market yet. And so to them, there was no rush.
Okay. So there's a bit of an education piece to it as well as the capacity requirement. But Shona, do you want to come in there? Thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah, I would say, just to piggyback off of what Cheryl said, is that, and it breeds so closely to that capacity, is sometimes people think that it's a much longer process than what it is. And it can be, there can be that very methodic process to it. Let's say if you're trying to get into a Whole Foods or like a large distributor or a Tesco or things along those lines. But on another end, it can be a very quick approach where someone wants your product, they'll have it on their shelves, they want to, you know, sign a partnership for your services. And you have to make sure that if you're, you know, if you're talking the talk, you're walking the walk. And I think that's very close with the capacity. If you don't have that, you know, we talk a lot about how you've kind of got first impressions matter, and you've kind of got one chance to get that first relationship right, or you're going to have to backtrack quite a bit. So if you don't have the capacity to match with a great relationship that you've built and a win, then that can set you back. It's the same as if you know, for instance, got onto Amazon in different countries, or the UK and Ireland, and you don't have enough to fulfill those requirements for Amazon and things along those lines. That can really be detrimental to your global expansion journey for many months, trying to, you know, rebuild that relationship and your presence on that e-commerce platform. So just kind of, I think those are great points from Cheryl that I think people really should take into account.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much. Cheryl, like, just back to you a little bit on the strategy piece. You know, and you did touch on this a little bit, but is there any is there any barriers to getting to the strategy right? Is it again, is it management capacity? Is it time? Is it financial? Or is there a hesitation to get somebody like yourself involved in terms of getting that external validation? What were the main barriers to getting that strategy right?
All of the above. I think
Okay.
it comes down to the challenge I think any professional service provider has with companies, in that they're very focused on the operational needs. And ATB Financial did this great survey a few years ago, and they asked businesses, where are you spending most of your time versus where should you be spending most of your time to grow your business? And what do you find most difficult? And not surprising, owners and managers were spending most of their time in operations. Yet when you looked at the importance of that for growing their business, it was quite low. That's something that their operations manager should have been handling. Or they were getting pulled into finance because they didn't have probably the appropriate financial controls and systems and a controller in place or someone who could handle that. And so on the international side, the same thing happens. It becomes a low priority within the company. And so yeah, that's the biggest risk, I think, is just being able to find the time. So then that ties into delegation and,
Yeah. So in terms of common mistakes, it's having the right people, communicating it, I'm sure. Talking about reducing risk, I don't know, I was going to move on to Sam here. Sam, are you okay in terms of connection? Okay. I think, there is obviously a lot of risk in terms of going global, and obviously financial risk is a big part of that. This costs money. Some of these companies are younger. Can you tell us a little bit more about your role at RBC and how you help your clients mitigate the different types of risks and how you help them mitigate those risks? I don't think we can hear you, Sam, apologies.
Can everyone hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so sorry everyone, and I have some technical difficulty, so you may see my video on and off, but I will try to explain to you. So I will see RBC Global Trade actually is one of the best kept secret within RBC. We have been actually named Best Trade Finance Bank by Global Finance magazine for 10 consecutive years. So as a trade finance specialist, what I do is really working with the company to help them diversify their supply chain, finding new customer or new supplier globally. And then from there, help them to identify the risk they were dealing with and then mitigate some of the risk from there. So we all know as an entrepreneur, when you run business, you're facing numerous risks domestically. You probably want to, if not 10 times, but at least triple the risk you are going to face when you're going outside Canada. I'm just using some example here. For example, performance risk. Both Shauna and Cheryl talk about the capacity, which is really translated into our terminology called performance risk. Do you have the ability to really deliver your promise to your customer overseas? Or on the flip side, is your supplier, your vendor, have the capacity to really supporting you so you can fulfill your commitment outside Canada? So that is all coming down to performance risk. And then it's coming down to documentary risk. Can you prepare the right document in order to have the product ownership successfully transferred, or can successfully confirm you complete your service job with another party? So that is calling about the documentary. And then we talk about foreign exchange. We are a trading country, but unfortunately, Canadian dollar is representing less than 1% in all the global trade. Over 60% of the global trade is settled either in US dollar, which representing about 34%, or euro, which representing almost the same weighting. So we will facing to deal with a foreign currency. How do you identify and handle all this risk? In the past several days, we're also talking about geopolitical uncertainty. So is there any kind of a sanction risk you may be facing? But above all, I always like to mention to everyone, to all the exporter, the single biggest risk is the payment risk. So it will be no good until you receive the money after you deliver the product and services. So payment risk, I will say that is the biggest risk.
And Sam, you know, if you're looking at, you mentioned some of the around performance risk and the documentation and like, how long does that process take? You know, when a company engages with you and they're just going into a new market for the first time, how do you engage with them and how do you kind of help them manage that process and how long does it take?
I will say it is a journey. I will never say it's a one step, like a one-day meeting, we can figure out everything. It's always start with building some awareness so you understand what you are dealing with, get some knowledge, and then we set up a strategy to manage all this risk together with you and also involve our partner like Michael on the panel from EDC, like our ecosystem, Shauna from the Calgary Economic, like Cheryl, including every old advisor in your ecosystem to make sure you can get professional advice, go through this trade journey you are going to set. So it's very difficult to see how long it will take. I will say, take us with you through this journey.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's hard to kind of, there's no one size fits all, I suppose. While I have you, Sam, and talking about risk, something that's been very, very topical for us over the last 5 or 6 years now is Brexit. You know, in terms of outward investment from Canada, the UK is one of the biggest destinations for companies from Canada. They go, you know, the UK market's a big attractive market. It's English speaking. There's long historic established cultural links there. And, you know, a lot of companies do look at UK for kind of their European presence. In the advent of Brexit, obviously, you know, that access to the EU market wasn't as clear or as transparent, or there was a period of time where nobody really knew what was going to happen. And in fairness, like I suppose Ireland benefited from that in a small way. Brexit is not good for anybody, but in terms of what we do, in terms of working with companies, setting up a lot of the, like Scotiabank, TD Bank, BMO, they all chose to put some they took some EU facing functions out of the UK and put it into Ireland to keep that kind of freedom of access into the market. We've seen it on the technology side, particularly where there was a tech aspect, a GDPR aspect to what they were doing. So in terms of data management, they didn't want to host that data in a country where it may not be easy to move across jurisdiction. So I'm just curious and interested in, I think we might have dropped Sam a little bit. So maybe Michael or Shona, has Brexit come up as a conversation with your clients, and how are they approaching it and thinking about it, or how did they approach it and think about it? It's ongoing, actually. Companies are still trying to manage it.
Yeah, one just quick thing on the end that I've seen with companies is that I would almost say, yes, it has been an opportunity for some companies. I know sometimes people are a little bit shy about saying that about some of these different events, but they have seen it as going about it a different way. And you know, in regards to Ireland specifically, they maybe hadn't looked at it as a region, as an area, a market of entry before. And now, you know, being something like, you know, the only primary English speaking part of, you know, Europe in that end, that is a big piece for companies that are looking and going in and kind of testing the waters of Europe and going into those markets. And I think, you know, that launching pad that you mentioned at the beginning is very real as it pertains to that right now. So I think they looked at Brexit and they maybe thought, okay, well, now we can focus kind of on two specific areas then. We take them apart. But I always, to be quite honest, suggest that companies do that when they're looking outward anyways. I don't think you should look at large regions because you can get a little bit confused and it can seem a little daunting. But I think it did make them kind of look at more pieces of the pie versus the entire thing. So I think it's been opportunities for companies.
Okay, interesting. Sam, do you want to come in there or on the Brexit piece?
No, I think definitely Shauna mentioned a very good point. It's always going to be this kind of an event, or we sometimes call it a shock coming from the external, just trying to see how it's going to really how it's going to impact your business. From our perspective, it's also treated as opportunity. Do you have a plan really managing this risk? When the UK is actually do the Brexit, as we talk about here, Ireland is naturally become a part of your destination in order for you to continue expanding your relationship in the European Union region.
Lost Sam.
And
Michael, I know
I was just
interested
going
to
to
hear
say
your aspect.
from an EDC standpoint, EDC follows OECD burn union guidelines. So whenever companies engage EDC, there's different country risk classifications for different markets, and Ireland is low. It's a low risk country, right? And it's a good, as Shona mentioned, it's almost like a springboard where I'm in Europe, and I'm not too far. Do you know what I mean? Like I can set up shop in Ireland. I can have an office there. If I need financing for it, from a performance standpoint, EDC helps these companies with partners like RBC, so that they have operating capital to run these wholly owned subsidiaries. It has been seen as an opportunity where it's like, okay, well, in life, there's always pivots. It's something that companies that need to, that survive need to be agile on. And without necessarily being an English barrier, it makes a lot of sense. And the time zones aren't too detrimental either when having satellite offices. So we've seen an uptick in interest and a lot of preliminary questions coming into our shop in terms of, what do I do? How do I set up shop in Ireland? How do I find access to bank support? And again, that's a bit preliminary for EDC because we come in more on the risk and transaction side, but again, we connect them with those players in the ecosystem to help with this springboard.
Oh, brilliant. That's interesting. And I didn't mean to make this about Brexit necessarily, but it is a question I get asked about all the time. And, there still is some moving parts there. So it's interesting to get your takes on it. And you touched on this about Ireland, Michael, and I might bring in Sean and Cheryl here as well. How important is ease of doing business for your clients when they're looking at, entering a new market or even setting up in a new market? Because, even if you look at the Canadian legal system, there's variations between Quebec and common law and civil law and all that fun stuff, and obviously huge variations across Europe as well. Is that something that becomes problematic for your clients? Is it something they think about? Do they think about immigration, like employment law? Does that come up in those conversations? And is it something that they, find challenging?
Yeah. I think these are all qualitative risks that they need to assess, and it's typically handled through partners like trade lawyers and things like that to make sure all of the documentary stuff is handled. But speaking from experience and subjectively, a lot of companies that look to go cross-border, whether it be reactive or proactive, they typically go where they find that they'll feel that there'll be the least resistance. So someone will go to the US before they go to China, or depending on what they're selling, or they'll go to Ireland before they go to Holland. Or in some cases, depending on what the tax laws are in specific markets, it's an area of interest to help them better protect their business, right? So a lot of the qualitative risk and the answers that need to be navigated, that's a lot of the heavy lifting actually before you actually come to a point where you have a trade receivable and you're trying to repatriate the monies that you make back to the Canadian parent co. But when a company can diversify its sales revenue, it diversifies its default rates too, right? Because it ultimately can survive off multiple revenue streams. And the questions that need to get answered first are often, I would say it's weighted 70-30. You know what I mean? You can find trade associations and markets once you're in there, but it's how to get in there first and do it in a graduated way where it makes sense and you're not going through all of your cash burn to then not have anything at the end of the tunnel, to Sam's point of market risk and payment risk.
No, it is. I don't say a minefield. That sounds worse than it is. But there's so many different considerations when companies are going through this process, and every company that I've worked with over the years put different weighting on different factors. So I think we have probably about 10 or 15 minutes left, and I want to maybe ensure that you have time to talk more about some of the supports and services that you offer in terms of helping companies that are on the call as they look internationally. And there is lots of one thing I'm really impressed by in Canada is there's so many different resources for companies, and I'm still finding a hard time navigating who exactly does what. So I think even though a lot of people on the call might know your organizations, it might be good to maybe talk through a little bit more. Maybe Cheryl, I'll start with you in terms of the Global Trade Service, how you can help companies roll out in new markets in terms of building strategies and I suppose getting access and executing successfully.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest challenges company owners have, I think, with exporting is just finding the time and attention and accessing the right resources at the right time. And so the Global Growth Trade Service is 60 hours of business coaching, international trade coaching, that's quite flexible in terms of how the client uses it. And so what I do is work with them through that process. I've heard a few people mention a few times being part of the journey. I think my lens through that comes in through how does this impact your organization, as well as looking what the opportunities are internationally, and what happens after you access that opportunity. So we talked about risk, and I think the services that EDC provides and the tools they have and legal agreements are great. But I think one of the biggest ways to reduce your risk is choosing the right partner and engaging and onboarding them correctly, your foreign partner in another market, and developing that relationship. It's like a unanimous shareholders agreement. You never want to have to go to the USA if you've got a dispute. You want the relationship and the way you've decided to work together with your partners to dictate how you deal with conflicts, not a legal agreement. And so I work with companies to really think about all of those things and how does that impact their company, down to the level of what are your job descriptions and who's actually got accountability for international markets and who's got the time for that. And if you're looking at other strategic initiatives within the company, like an ERP and lean manufacturing, can you really actually have enough time for this international initiative right now? So that's what we do in that 60 hours of coaching. It's quite flexible, but the idea is to just get companies to market faster than they would on their own and start realizing that export revenue more quickly without blowing up their current business.
And Cheryl, who typically engages with you then? Is it C-level or founder level, or is it finance? Like who typically do you engage with throughout that consultancy, or is it all across an organization?
Typically, we work with mid-sized businesses, so it would usually be the owner of the company. Sometimes they'll have an international sales manager, or their VP of sales will also take on the international piece, but it's typically the company owner, which is why we have that struggle of getting their time and attention, right? Because they're involved in so many things.
Again, so many different things, absolutely, yeah. But I mean, your expertise working with lots of different companies on this specific issue is obviously what adds the huge amount of value. So that's super. And Michael, just on EDC, like your engagement model, like how I suppose, what sort of solutions do you offer, and how do you go about it?
Absolutely. So I guess EDC is mostly known for mitigating the very important thing that Sam mentioned, which is payment risk. So once a lot of companies go cross-border, you can't necessarily just go and get your product back or render your service back if it's over an ocean. And what we offer is something that mitigates against that non-payment through a trade receivable insurance. And it's a solution whereby if a company is looking to pivot and go cross-border and it's scary, and they look at the numbers and it's something whereby either it's very heavy concentration risk, or it's something where they don't necessarily know the counterparty too well, or they're looking at their income statement and it's a matter of, well, I can't afford to pay for this twice if I don't get paid. We mitigate 90% of that invoice value for a lot of these companies going cross-border, net that down payment. Which can be for a widget moving cross-border, it could be for a service rendered, it could be for many different types of receivables depending on how their cash flow cycle works. Maybe it's performance milestones, maybe it's rental payments for specific assets, and that's what we primarily do to help mitigate that payment risk. In addition to that, we mitigate performance risk as well. So for example, if Sam and RBC are having challenges with the jurisdiction of a specific market or the concerns of a company's default rates, we often come in to help the bank through a credit enhancement to help them help a company who's going cross-border, so that they can create that GDP and create that sale. So we either look at risk on the front end of who the company is that's exporting, or we look at risk on the back end in terms of making sure they get paid. That's primarily what we do. Everything else is ancillary in terms of the support to get to that transaction.
Brilliant. Okay, that really clarifies it. And I guess, yeah, everyone wants to get paid at the end of the day, so that makes absolute sense. And Sam, I mean, one of the because obviously RBC, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your kind of thoughts on banking in Europe. Like one of the biggest challenges, sorry, I know I'm going back to Europe, but obviously from an Irish perspective, you know, can you help clients in terms of their banking needs in Europe, or do you provide it here in Canada, or do you partner with I suppose RBC has a presence there as well? How do you typically do that?
Okay, we do it actually through different way to help Canadian business. I will take a little bit step back here just to mention about another additional resource available for the Canadian business to really help them to build some knowledge, build some awareness in order for them to expanding their business outside Canada. RBC has been putting together a great tool called RBC Global Connect. By the way, it's free of charge for all Canadian business. It's we trying to provide like knowledge for the Canadian business so they are at least build some awareness of the overseas market. It do not substitute, it do not replace what the great work Cheryl and her team is doing, but it really gives some companies some basic information. What is the overseas market looks like based on your particular product? All you need to do is type in your product, you can find what is the market out there. How much US is buy from my particular product, how much Chinese is buying, how much Japanese is buying, what it looks like, what is their regulation, what resource I can find, how do I even know, do we have a tax treaty between Canada and my destination? So all that information is actually at your fingertip, which is free of charge for all the Canadian business, which you can at least gain some awareness, and from there to continue engage the professional to get like coaching so you are export ready. So when you're coming down to the export ready, you're probably coming down to the question, well, if I go to the Ireland, do I need to open a bank account there, or how do I do it? It's always, I will say, coming down to figure out what is the best for you. Do you need a physical location there? Do you need to have a physical bank account there, or everything can be hybrid? So we do one thing is from RBC's perspective, I'm not saying on behalf of other financial institution, we are part of the global banking. So we do have offices in London, we do have offices in Frankfurt. So from time to time, we actually do facilitate introduction to help Canadian business to have some footprint in the overseas. As I mentioned, we do have, I think as of now, we still have 10 offices around global, and we have almost 70 professionals around the global to help the business to be successful in their overseas. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, I guess just,
sorry, go ahead,
I guess
Michael.
just on that, Deidre, in addition to the connections that RBC provides, let's say a company needs to, they set up a subsidiary and they need working capital in Ireland, and the bank looks at them and says, well, you have no track record here because you're a brand new company. I don't see any financials, I can't lend you money. But the parent company is here in Canada. And let's just say they're a client of RBC. Well, if RBC needs to help them finance working capital to the subsidiary through a local bank, we can support that through RBC standard level of care. So if their financial due diligence merits additional working capital support based on the expected accounts receivables through the company's business operations, EDC has credit enhancements that they can provide to RBC to help share in the risk profile given it's a cross-border jurisdiction.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you for that. I'm just conscious of time, and there is a couple of questions in the Q&A box. So Laureen, I think there's actually some here that are specific to individuals and also for the panel. I might take one for the panel and throw it out, maybe start with you, Shauna, and see, and we take it from there. So our current environment throws so much uncertainty, inflation, geopolitical, global supply. where is the most concern that should capture our focus for outreach? And I suppose you touched on this earlier in terms of like at the end of the day, it's capacity and having the right thought process around this. But I suppose what are the top concerns you're seeing for companies right now, given what's going on globally?
Yeah, of
and
course.
Where should they focus?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say don't focus so hard on the roadblocks or the things that are happening around the world, because it can get quite distracting for you. I'd say stick to your plan, right? Focus on your plan. Take these into consideration, like the global supply chain issues right now, the fact that none of us could have predicted, a global pandemic that's gone on for this long and things along those lines. Like you do have to, look at the risks, look at risk mitigation, but don't let them distract you from your plan. Because, in the last year, we saw TAP alumni, we had 34 trade deals done in 2021. That is fantastic, right? And people say, well, it's been a global pandemic. I'm like, yes, but business did not stop. They assessed the roadblocks, they looked at the risk, they mitigated the risk, and they still went out there and, went global, and they had their plan. So for me, it's almost, you can get so distracted. It's the same as a human being right now with the state of different things going on in the world. It can get very, it can weigh heavy on you, and it can get distracting, and from many different areas, even from your mental health. And as a business owner too, that does come into play. So I would say for the most part, focus on your plan. And to me, that would be one of the most important sides. But taking into account, for instance, I know we all know on the call, I was in LA last week, and actually seeing the ships at Long Beach and the backup there from the supply chain issues, that was pretty, you hear about it a lot on the news, but when you see it in person, you're like, holy moly, that's a problem. So yeah, I would say don't turn a blind eye to it, but just strategically look at it.
Great. And we actually just on the positive side, we did, even from our business, there was 2020, obviously when this all kicked off, there was a lot of like, okay, let's watch and wait and see what happens. So, companies kind of, some of them went along, but a little bit more slowly. But then once, vaccines started being rolled out, things started opening, people kind of seen light at the end of the tunnel. 2021 for us in terms of employment creation and new companies set up in Ireland was a bumper year. Some of that was pent up from the year before and people executing kind of a bit later. But, last year we had we've seen 10 years of growth in our portfolio of companies, like without any decrease in terms of headcount. And we today have the most people ever employed by international companies ever recorded. And we've been around for 70 years. So despite everything that's going on, as you said, business is still happening. Again, obviously some sectors are impacted worse, more than others, but even on the supply chain side, we have a company out of Montreal in the logistics space that actually huge opportunity here. They really didn't have a footprint in Europe. They were Asia and North America. And because of what was going on, they were like, okay, we need to own our infrastructure in Europe. They were working with partners. So they've set up an office in Ireland and are building out their European infrastructure from there. So it does drive opportunity as well as roadblocks, I suppose.
I would say that, and as it pertains to the pandemic, I think there has been that pivotal shift, as what Cheryl said too, with, the Zoom and that digital. Regions, countries, suppliers, companies that maybe would have been more of that slower in-person, multiple visits, have changed the way that they're doing business. And I think an ease of doing business from a global perspective too. I think we think a little bit more about the human side of it also, which I think sometimes, especially in North America, we can get quite clinical with our work. And I think that we took a step back from that in 2021 and 2020. So I think that's been kind of some positives too.
Brilliant. Lorraine, I know there's a number of questions there and I'm just conscious of time. Do you want to pick one or two so I'm not favoriting one over another?
I think that I'd like to understand a bit better from a macro skills development. Tracy's asking, does the panel see any macro skills development needs?
In terms of facilitating international expansion?
Right, exactly, yeah. When you're understanding the ecosystem you're going into, she says.
Sorry, just if I can clarify, macro skills in terms of like the understanding of and the language, like that.
Well, her exact words are, help us better understand the ecosystem. Does the panel see any macro skills development needs?
Now, this might be wrong. But from the
Tracy,
question,
you can jump in the chat if you want to clarify, but go on.
Like I think one thing I see from business is that they're looking, and this is more of a qualitative as you're looking at macro skills in the ecosystem. I see a lot of businesses that they're scaling and their growth and their capacity. And as Michael said, some of these CEOs or the CFOs or the coordinators, you know, and things in general, you know, I'm off base in what she said. You know, I personally will say from a government perspective, though, from what you said here, Tracy, that they're starting to get it really well, I think, with, you know, small businesses, startups, multi-sectors. I think that governments are realizing that they, you know, it's not just about those ginormous companies that are going into different markets, that the earlier you help them, the better prepared they're going to be. But I think I'll leave that to, you know, Cheryl, Michael, Sam for some more feedback.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you, Tracy, for clarifying. I guess in terms of what governments can do, so EDC operates at arm's length from the federal government. So our mandate is driven based on what we see from our economists, our shareholders, which are Canadian companies, in terms of how to pivot and where to spend our efforts. And given we operate on commercial principles on a non-tax funded basis, we can put those emphases in areas where there's still growth. So for Alberta, there's still a heavy focus on oil and gas. There's also a growing focus for clean energy, agri-food, agribusiness. And these are all areas where it's not necessarily to the provincial or to whoever's in party in power in Ottawa. It's more so in terms of what is the dynamic need coming from the market, what is the market risk associated with it, and where is the gap that we need to bridge to help these companies go cross-border.
Yeah, as what I want to retain is, as a financial institution, it's very difficult for us to see really something from macro perspective. But I will say, have an open conversation. Have an open conversation with your advisor. Have an open conversation with the panelists here, and let them know your plan. And they will direct you within the ecosystem, help you to identify the opportunity, and also direct you to the different government resources in order to help you to accomplish your goal. And I want to add one thing here is, as a Canadian, we have a natural disadvantages, which is we are too nice. A lot of the time when we trust people, naturally we trust people. But when we go overseas, sometimes that either means we taking on some unnecessary risk, or sometimes means because we are a little bit on the conservative side, so we give up some opportunity. Right. So we have to leveraging the network you have, leveraging all the professional you saw here today, and have a conversation. Let the journey begin. Identify where is the opportunity, what is the risk. At the bottom line, I can speak on behalf of EDC, on behalf of RBC, Shauna and Cheryl here. We are here to support your success. We will provide you the resource you need, help you mitigate certain risk you may be facing when you go overseas, and help you have a successful and a wonderful trip journey overseas.
I think just on the skills piece, even stepping back a bit from again, it's something that Canada is doing really well, and the Irish government is really pushing as well. Like the number one priority for like most of the companies I talk to and our clients is skills, it's talent, it's getting the right people. You know, it's just all they talk about: hiring, skills, and immigration is a big part of that too. And Canada's done that very well. It's one, you know, it's growing from a population perspective. Ireland hit 5 million people last year for the first time since the famine, so we're very proud of that. But you know, so we, you know, but we're also very open in terms of immigration, because we know that skills are really the driver of the economy. So bringing the right skills in, but also working with third level institutions to ensure that the right skills are coming out of the university. It's happening here in Canada. You've got AI centers, cyber centers. So, you know, there's lots of different developments happening in this space. In Ireland, for example, the first, I think they developed the first masters in cybersecurity. Now, this is about 10 years ago, but it was the first one that was really focused and developed with industry. Just last year, they launched an immersive software engineering degree with Stripe. And I think, I don't know if Shopify were involved. I think TD Bank were involved. So basically developing, so the students are working, they're obviously going through their university courses, but they're spending 6 months a year with industry learning the technologies. So, you know, there's a huge focus. I see it here in Canada, see it in Ireland, that basically developing skills is key. Because if you don't have the people, or, you know, at the end of the day, you know, what are you going to do? So
That's right.
yeah.
Well,
I think that kind of brings us to the time, Lorraine. Thank you so much, guys, for your insights. And I'll hand over to Lorraine and maybe to wrap up.
Listen, thank you, everyone. You know, there are really, I think that some highlights here. There's some rich resources available to companies and leaders when they're looking at going global. It's important really not to take this step with your company, whether large or small, in isolation, to reach out to the support network and start planning. And while there's lots of risk in going global, that with that proper preparation and that expertise that we obviously have at our fingertips, and we've seen today, companies can succeed in going global. So I want to thank all of our panelists today for taking the time to prepare and to have such a great dialogue. Thank you for that. And for our expert moderator, Deirdre, thank you from IDA. For those of you who joined, we will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to this recording in the next few days. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors. First of all, Invest Alberta, foundation sponsor of the Ireland Alberta Trade Association. Then our event sponsors today, RBC Global Trade, Calgary Economic Development, and IDA Ireland. And a special thank you to Thomas at Calgary Economic Development for making all of this technology go for us. Thank you, Thomas. You can find out more about the Ireland Alberta Trade Association at irelandalbertatrade.com. And you can follow us, please, on our new Twitter address, which is at Ireland Alberta, and on LinkedIn, of course, to stay up to date on upcoming events and information that our organization provides in support of opportunities for trade between Ireland and Alberta. A big thank you again to our group here today. Wishing everyone who joined much success in your foray into global trade. And I look forward to seeing all of you again very soon, perhaps in person. Stay well and stay safe. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Take care. Have a lovely afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.